Hi, welcome to White Women Wake Up. I'm Karen.
And I'm Jonelle. We're here to explore how we can challenge cultural norms, unpack our privilege, and foster empathy through raw intergenerational conversations. Let's wake up together.
Yay! And this is becoming a little bit of a segment, but did you do your homework?
Yes and yeah.
It's not really homework.
No.
It's just a reflection on our last podcast, which was, why are we doing this podcast?
Yes,
yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay, you go first.
Well, I'm glad, when you brought up that conversation, I was kind of like, wow, okay, why are we doing this? But I do think it's good to have a documented space for our philosophies. And I also think it is good because we're so new into this podcast, we don't really know what we're doing, right? We just wanted to record these conversations. And so we've been doing some research on, clickbait. I hate to say it's clickbait, but we're doing research. And then yet, what we really desire is to have conversations around bias and privilege. And so I was glad you're bringing this up.
Good.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
My week, I would say I'm feeling kind of two spectrums of things. I am both feeling like excited and elated about what we're doing. Like this energizes me. On the other hand, I've had moments of defeat.
Yeah.
This can get tough. And I know that's part of unpacking privilege. And I've been doing this for years. And so I don't know why I keep thinking it'll get easier. And the more I dig, sometimes the harder it gets.
Yeah.
But what has really been resonating with me, it's something you have said before, and I don't know if you said it on this podcast or just you've said it a lot in life, but we as white women have the ability to walk away. We can shut off our brains and we can go back into our society that has been built and normalized for us as white people, and we cannot think about this stuff. And so I've really been wrestling as I have been defeated, and my mind is like, oh, just take a break from thinking about this. And I realized no, that is part of the privilege. And this is part of the work that I need to continue to do, and not sit in it like a martyr, but keep things front of mind, keep things in a different perspective than I might have if I'm able to shut it off. And I think some of the best analogy I could give out there, and I know we did a whole segment on don't compare, but I'm hoping this would kind of resonate with some people is, so often as we know in the household, the mental load of the household goes often on the female of the household. And the male truly has no concept, and this is generalized obviously, but a lot of men have no concept of the mental load that the household and the family and the kids really bring on the female of the household. And I think that's very similar, and not very similar, but in an essence, could help us maybe understand a little bit more the load and the mental load that goes on people of color, other marginalized communities, this is something they can't shut off. And so that's been something that's kind of it's been on my mind lately, and I've really been trying to just focus and steadfast to move forward. But again, these topics are exciting me, so.
Well, I've got a topic today.
Great, I'd love to hear it.
Two things, historical things.
Perfect.
That I'm going to center on the conversation.
Okay.
So the first thing, I don't know what prompted this, but the word Caucasian.
Okay.
So I saw that, and then I thought, what does that even mean? What does Caucasian even mean? So I did a little research.
I have no clue.
You have no clue?
No clue.
I know, no clue. And so what I found, and this is pretty wild, is that there was a researcher that did brain research in the 1800s, and he happened to find a skull. And this skull was a bigger skull than normal. And he found it in the Caucasian region, which is like Russia, Azerbaijan, kind of East Asian, in that region. And he said this must be, because it's a big brain, it must be a perfect brain, and therefore it must be a white brain.
Of course.
And that's how we've adopted the name
white man.
Caucasian. So now I'm excited to, on the demographic surveys, say I'm white and not Caucasian. So that was one. And then since my subject is going to be on white culture, I started again. This is a dive I've done in the past, but I think it's so interesting. Is the idea that when did race become a construct in the United States?
Ooh.
And so race became a construct. And there's, again, if you want to go deep diving, it was like 1670, I think it was 1676. It's called the Bacon's Rebellion. And what happened was around that period of time, immigrants from primarily England, Germany, and Ireland were coming to the United States, and they, along with the Black community in these regions like Virginia, they started uprising against the white elite. The elite. It wasn't white at that time, but the elite. And so what the elite did was they started segregating laws that were actually racial. So they made racial laws for the Irish, the German, and the English immigrants differently than racial laws for the existing Blacks.
Wow.
And so many of them were, and it just kept going from the 1670s on. And many of them were, the right to sell, to do things, to be involved. And so prior to that, we didn't think of race. I mean, and it's really hard for us to it's so embedded in our psyche. So anyways, my conversation today is on white culture. Okay. So before I begin, or before we talk this out, when you hear the word white culture, what do you think about?
Oh, I mean, I have to say, probably not great things. I think of privilege. I think of overstepping. I think of bland. Like, we think of like in society, we make fun of white people for having like bland food and like.
And remember, you're white. This is your culture.
Obviously, I'm. But that doesn't mean I'm not. Wait, where did that come?
I know.
From?
I think sometimes we can own it from a big sense and not from a personal space. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I own it. Well, I guess that's an interesting concept, because I think so often I know people who, when you say white privilege or white men, get really offended because they're owning that within their own culture. I think this is tricky. I've done a lot of work to, one, separate myself from that culture, but that's also not necessarily like a positive thing either, because it's not then helping embed the issues into those cultures. Yeah. So I kind of see what you're saying there. But that still doesn't mean I can't think that notoriously white people make bad Jell-O. I mean, our family's from the Midwest.
Yeah.
Bad Jell-O, unflavored food with like
with marshmallows in it.
With marshmallows in it.
Well, I think you hit on a good point, because part of culture is food. Absolutely. Yeah. So wait, I want to.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to
go on.
It's a little bit, because I've over the years had my students do kind of cultural exercises, visual stories around their cultural spaces. And it's really interesting. A lot of my students, especially if you're a first-gen students, have no challenge with an ethnic culture. They really see foods, they see maybe patterns, they see religions, they see different things around their culture. My white students all have a challenge coming up with a culture. In fact, they all make statements like, oh, I wish I had a culture. Why I think this is so important to talk about this is everybody has a culture. The downside is our white culture is so normative as majority people, we no longer think our culture it's like it hasn't impacted because it's just there. When in fact, it's impacted everything.
Well, and I think that's so interesting too, because I took it from the other way of, I understand that it impacts things. So then, to your point, I was kind of negative on it. I was a little bit down on the culture. And it kind of sounds like your students similar either say, oh, I don't have a culture, because maybe they're kind of embarrassed of their culture, whether they consciously or subconsciously know that. They might be like, oh, I don't want to be part of this bland Jello salad community.
Yeah, I just don't think they've thought about it because everything works in their system. So they don't see their system as a culture. So
I see what you're saying.
So let me unpack this a little bit.
Interesting. Okay.
So I started, when I knew I was going to have this subject, I started thinking about, especially more from my histories growing up, what were things that were very normative and what were some of the values? Because culture just means a system of community having shared values, shared kind of foods. There's a shared system in there. And so I grew up in a majority white culture in a suburb of Chicago. Excuse me. And in that suburb, 99% of the people were Christian. So the Christian way of doing religious services was normative. So none of us went to a Jewish synagogue. That would have looked awkward to us, and that was not deemed normal. The foods we ate, there was a lot of hamburger. In fact, McDonald's was done where I was. The foods we ate were normative. I think there was one Chinese restaurant, and that was really outside of the cultural norm. So what I'm saying is when all of these things, kind of like the head, when all of these things are so repetitive and so familiar, they become looked at as better. And even whether we want to assign them as better, that's the way they're assigned. It even goes deeper. If you look at the way that so many of our Christian spaces were organized in dialogue with each other. In my church, we wouldn't get up and sing outside of what the pastor would say, stand up, sit down, that sort of thing. So that kind of behavior, response, that call down response behavior was very common. And again, because it was familiar, it was considered okay. So this is what I want people to do, is to unpack. And yeah, like what you're saying is, God, maybe it's a little ludicrous. Why are we doing laws the way I see laws should be? And why don't we collectively, like I love researching different cultures and how they've come up with their judicial systems. Why don't we do things from different cultural perspectives? Anyways, that's my part of this.
Well, I think what I'm starting kind of thinking about, unpacking in my head, which is so interesting, is as you start to talk about your upbringing and your white culture, and again, audience, she's my mother, so I none of this is unfamiliar to me. I've been back to Chicago. I've seen that culture. But I think the thing is I'm reflecting on my own as growing up in Seattle in a very diverse area.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's better, but I in some ways almost a little bit worse, because I was so exposed to different cultures. I almost was a little ignorant that my culture was still a majority.
Yeah.
If a little bit more. And when I grow up, I definitely reflect on, I was in a time and in Seattle where it was very like, I don't see color.
Yeah.
It's very like mixed culturally. And so
And going back to that.
People are, and it's really tough.
Yeah.
But so it's interesting you bring that up, because I think when I think of white culture, like I said, I think of your Midwestern roots.
Yeah.
So like that's kind of what I'm like speaking to. But it doesn't, what is the word? It's not an accurate representation though of also still the white culture that I lived in growing up here. But even though, because my white culture was exposed to more diversity, doesn't mean it still wasn't majority white culture. And so I guess that's what I'm kind of getting at.
So here's a good example from you when you were raised. I remember, and you had a very diverse school, because we went to public schools and it was very diverse at the time. Busing was existing and so forth. But I remember you wanting to play with some of your friends with different ethnic backgrounds. And it wasn't always welcomed by other families. And I just thought that was so odd. I thought, no, seriously, Liz, you're kind of shocked by
I am. I didn't know that.
And I saw it from my white perspective, my white lens, that I was kind of being shunned, or you were being shunned, because I never thought that this kind of communal gathering couldn't exist, that it wasn't safe. Now looking back at that in hindsight, and actually even doing more research on kind of immigration and ethnicity, some of your friends may not have been documented. And so the idea of coming into a community to hang out, that wasn't an okay thing. Some of your friends, their parents were they were suspect of our white traditions, rightfully so. And so this idea of Jonelle's a little shocked because that happened. I was colorblind. I would invite a lot of different people over to our home, and it wasn't always reciprocated. And in hindsight, at first I was offended because I took it from my white perspective. But now looking back at that, I'm sure it had a lot of other reasons of why someone from a different culture, especially a first-gen culture, or they were a generation that just came here, were not easily able to play. Or maybe parents were working and I didn't know about this. So one of the things I want to go down this road, Janelle's like in a state of shock because she's like, wow, I didn't even think about it. But it is this normative. So in other words, what I'm saying is, I was embedding my normative perceptions on how myself as a white person would interact with play dates, with friends, with other family members, and especially if they were coming from different cultures. I assumed they would take on my cultural norm and my way of interacting with people, and I never even asked them what was comfortable with the way that they interacted. Maybe they would have loved coming over if it wasn't just child to child, if it was family to family. Maybe there were other ways to engage in those play dates. But okay, so I want to ask you some bigger questions.
Wait, can I comment on that though? I mean, I think you've talked a lot about this, and you've said I've shocked, but you haven't let me jump in here.
Sorry.
First of all, I am very surprised that you definitely sheltered me from a lot of that. And it totally makes sense that maybe some communities that are different than ours would not necessarily, have the same, I think, perspectives on hanging out or things of that. But also, I'm really surprised. I didn't think about it from the perspective that some other white families maybe kind of found it uncomfortable. Like you said, that I was making friends with different people, like in different neighborhoods and as a kid, I literally had no understanding
I didn't
of that.
see, that might have been misinterpreted. I didn't see that from we have a pretty a community that is multiracial. I didn't see that from other white families. What I saw was persons, perhaps when I would ask people from different cultures to come out and hang out and play with us. But again, remember, I was always using my normative invitations.
Yeah.
How you played with all your other white friends. And so maybe if I actually had stopped and said, hey, I would like our kids to get together outside of school. My daughter's talking about this, your daughter or your son, or in a lot. How would that look like for you? What would serve your community best? I never stopped to do that.
And as we know now, as we are understanding now, there's so many working parents who might not have the time, to your point. Yeah. They might want to be with their child when they're playing with a new family. I also think I've learned so much through TikTok, from different, there's so many people who actually genuinely don't believe in sleepovers, and they don't believe in sleepovers because honestly, the number one perpetrator of child pedophilia are white men.
Yeah, scary.
And it's really scary to think about, but I don't then blame.
We would never think about that because we trust.
Because we trust. It's like you said, white culture is within our own white culture. But of course, if you're in a different culture and you hear that you
Yeah.
hear that statistic, of course you're going to be a little bit more nervous and scared for your child.
Yeah.
And so anyways, I just think that's like
So the thing is, part of white culture is taking our normative experiences, what white people consider normative, and because we're majority, it's the normative familiar culture, and placing those ideas, those principles, those set of rules, those behavioral systems on other cultures. It's not that our culture is wrong, it's that we don't ask or that we don't look at. So in other words,
we assume.
Okay,
We're dominating and we assume.
That's the word. That's the word, we assume. So I wanted to ask you one of the questions, and again, I've had more time to think about this. One of the big things that I think is pervasive in white culture is this individualism and this consistency of wanting to be polite and enjoy. Like I'm happy, let's be happy. Even, so I think we need to look at that and look at how our politeness also polices behaviors of other people. I know I've policed you, and sometimes you've been a little abrasive to some of my comments, and I've policed that as in not like, oh, you're being rude. That's instead of being polite. But I think that those are some of the things that I've inherently grabbed on. But I want to ask you a question. So real quick, I don't know where we're at with time, but one of the questions that comes up is, how do you think white culture has influenced our policies or I know it's big, but I think unpacking that is really important. Policies or privilege within laws. Talk about it.
Well, I don't think that's big. I think that's a pretty just matter-of-fact statement. Our policies are built on inherited white culture and white idealism.
Okay, so if this is a shame-free environment,
yes,
matter of fact may not be matter of fact for everybody. Some people may not have thought about that they may not have thought about that perhaps, the Constitution was built primarily by Presbyterians, that a Christian tradition. A lot of people might not have thought about that.
But that still doesn't mean it's not matter of fact.
I know, but I guess maybe the abrasiveness of matter of fact.
Oh,
so you're right.
So
I'm
it's not
trying to be polite.
Yeah.
But anyway, so this idea of, for one, because the laws were written in my favor, and I felt like over the years the laws were written, as they benefited me as a white person, I didn't think about them as much. It's not until recently that certain laws are starting to take away from my privileges.
Well,
anyways, I just wanted to ask you that.
No, but I guess I think you wanted a much more complex answer. And I think in my mind, there's nothing convoluted about it. It's very clear that our laws have been written by white men with the purview of white men and white culture. And so there's to me, that's not even complicated. It's very clearly, I think what's more interesting about it is I know a lot of people who are definitely much more in, like you said, the laws have been written for them. So they're very much more in line of follow the laws, follow the things, the philosophy of just...
Grandma would say, peace at any price.
Peace, I guess, kind of thing. And then what I find fascinating is more and more as we're building out diverse thinking laws, especially here in Washington State, we're trying to kind of think through things.
I like to call them humanist laws.
Oh, love that. Humanist laws. The more that Washington is trying to build out, Washington State, I should say, not DC. The more as Washington State is trying to build out humanist laws, I find it fascinating that so many of the people who were for some of these big initial government positions are no longer in favor of some of these more diverse thinking laws. And there's so many examples around, silly things when it comes to bikers or this or just environmental laws. But I find it fascinating. And it's because for the first time, it might not be written from the lens of just benefiting white people.
Or a one majority culture.
One majority
and
culture.
And maybe that's part of this shift is like the white culture is leaning less as the majority culture.
Yeah.
And so now this diversity of opinion and thought is becoming more normative.
Yeah.
And we're uncomfortable because it was easier just to assume everyone was doing it our way.
Yeah. And we say that here from, again, a perspective of Washington State. We recently visited, we were in Indianapolis for the Taylor Swift concert. Woohoo! The Eras tour. This was a couple months ago. And it was fascinating. I had not been in a red state in a while. And it was really interesting. We talked to some people and just the perspective of what is going on there versus our perspective of progress in Washington are very different.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to emphasize that when we are talking about like diverse opinions and, you know, white becoming the less majority, we really are speaking to our contextual view of Washington State right now. I know this is not the same in a lot of places, and this is why we still need to keep working. We just wanted to give that context.
I also think, you know, as younger people are traveling all over the world. I mean, world travel is, I remember when I first started teaching college 20 years ago, maybe one or two people had been out of the country. And now 90% of these students they're from other countries, they've lived in other countries, or they've traveled to other countries. And we're seeing that the way that we do this in this, you know, white Eurocentral space of America, United States, isn't the way it's being done in other places. And often the way it's being done in other places is better. Or it's as good and strong. It's not less than.
Or better as more human-centered.
Yeah, more human-centered. And so I think, okay, so maybe the homework. Okay, so white culture was the theme today.
Okay.
And it's still going to obviously be the theme going on because I think that there's so many things to unpack about our desire for individualism, our desire to be polite and kind, which has gotten people like Karens in trouble. But I do think watching where we just assume, maybe it's the assumptions, you know, we assume everyone's doing it our way, or we assume the way that we did it is better. I mean, we've built a whole demographic, Caucasian, over an assumption that a bigger brain is a better brain. Where did that come from? Or a bigger skull. It wasn't even a bigger brain. It was a bigger skull was a better way, which we know in history. Any scientist out there is going to say, whoa, 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 whoa on that one. So we are building ideologies around ideas that may be a little dated, not as concrete, biased, and so forth. So let's look at assumptions this week and where did we just kind of assume it's our way or the highway, and how do we impose those on other people? So, anyways,
great homework,
great
conversation.
So thank you for showing up. Thanks for joining us on White Women Wake Up. We hope today's conversation sparked some reflection and inspired you to engage with the world in a new and more thoughtful way. Remember, this journey is about learning and unlearning and showing up with authenticity. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and connect with us on social media. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, we're at White Women Wake Up on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube.
Whoa!
See you there.
So keep waking up.
Bye. Have a great week.
Bye.